Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Escaping Atheism. This is Max Kolbe. I'm joined here today with another escapee or refugee from atheism. He's a biochemist. He's a blogger writing something called the Book of Works. His name is Cy Garte. Did I say that name right? Garte?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And first name Cy, which I assume is short for something, but Cy will work.
Right.
Cy, what is your background as far as religion goes, starting from, let's say, childhood, maybe?
Well, I had a very religious background, but it was not the normal kind of religion. My parents were members of the American Communist Party, and I grew up with a religion that was part Marxist and part strong atheist.
Well, Marxism kind of is already an atheist ideology.
It sure is, yep.
Not even kind of. I didn't need to say kind of. You'll find a few religious, theistic, God-believing Marxists, but they seem really pretty hard. So you were raised a commie, basically, to use the old-fashioned terms.
The slang term was red diaper baby.
How old are you?
Am I now?
Yeah, is that a rude question?
No, I'm 69.
You are old enough to be a red diaper baby.
Indeed.
You're old enough. You're within spitting distance of people like David Horowitz and Ron Radosh, and a little younger than them, I think. But for anybody who's not listening, the red diaper babies were a very well-known at one time social phenomenon of largely Jewish and other immigrants who were communists in the 50s and 60s, but they didn't like using the word communist in public. Is that a good short summary, or did I just...
Yeah, they didn't like using the word communist in public because they could go to jail in the 50s. So it was very hush-hush. I didn't know, in fact, that my parents were members of the Communist Party until many, many years later, because it would have been dangerous for me to know too much information.
A lot of the kids from that generation of communists have a very similar story. I know I just referenced it as if everybody knows. Obviously, Cy does. Two really interesting books to read on the red diaper baby phenomenon are Commies by Ron Radosh. Don't know if you've read that, Cy, but it's a good book. Real good book, short. Funny story about Bianca Jagger there. And the other would be Radical Son by David Horowitz. Horowitz has gone very right-wing. I think Ron Radosh is still sort of a moderate, but they both have interesting stories to tell about growing up with parents, communist parents, and how secretive that was. Members of Peter, Paul, and Mary also have similar stories, it turns out.
Oh, yes.
Now we're getting pretty deep into the politics. So you were basically raised in an atheist religion, is what I would think.
Yes, it was. It wasn't just that there was no God, no religious content, but I was raised with the understanding that religion, and Christianity in particular, but all religion, is evil and destructive. So it was bad. It wasn't just wrong.
Yeah, and that's a common atheist belief. In fact, I'll just notice how often I talk about atheist political ideologies and atheist beliefs and all that, and we'll get modern atheists say, there's no such thing. Well, we don't believe you, and there's no reason to believe you, because the talking points... Actually, I even find... I'll just ask your opinion on this. Have you noticed that atheism runs really high in socialists, and it also runs really high in libertarians?
Yes, I have.
It's like if they don't go socialist, they go libertarian 9 times out of 10.
Right.
With the rare one who calls himself a conservative, which I find fascinating on multiple angles. But when did you start questioning your view of the cosmos and the atheist proposition?
Well, it actually started, although it was unconscious at the time, when I went to see a film with a girl I was dating when I was in college. It turned out she was a Christian, but kept it quiet. I didn't know she was Christian. And she brought me to see the film, The Passion According to St. Matthew by Pasolini, an Italian film. And it had a remarkable effect on me. There's one incredibly moving scene when the stone is rolled back from the tomb and you see the empty tomb. But what was incredibly emotional was the music, which the filmmaker changed from this very somber Russian mass, and then when the tomb is revealed and it's empty, one hears this beautiful African mass called Misaluba, which was very popular in those days. And the shift from that very somber dirge to this joyous music just sent shivers up and down my spine. And I remember thinking, no, this is a trick. It's not really true that this miracle, so-called miracle, happened, and I'm just being responsive to the music. Years later, I understood that that was really the first conscious time that I was aware of the call of the Spirit. But I rejected it and paid no more attention to it. And it was only after I had been studying science for many years and I became a scientist that I began seeing things in the science that I was learning that were not consonant with the atheist, materialistic, reductionist viewpoint that I'd always held. And at that point, I began questioning atheism, the way many Christians sometimes question parts of their faith. I began questioning this very dogmatic, very rigid, atheistic stance that, there cannot be a God. And I began wondering about that because there were some things I was learning about science that didn't quite fit.
Now, as an ex-atheist myself, I don't find that surprising. To soapbox a little, and then I'm going to ask you more about you, but it does seem like there's this, I have to call it a propaganda meme, a propaganda slogan, whatever it is. There's this absurd thing that you hear commonly asserted by popular atheists now, and it's made its way into the lower culture, of my atheism is just lack of belief. And every time I hear that, I think, wow, how did they get away with that? I mean, I'm sure you've run into that, right? My atheism is just lack of belief?
Yes. I agree that that's nonsense. I don't think it's possible for a human being to have a lack of belief.
Well, bricks lack belief, and coma patients appear to lack beliefs. So there is that. I mean, the other fast one that comes out is witch god, and it's like, now wait a minute. Philosophically, it's been known for thousands of years. God's a universal concept. Once you start asking questions about, which idea of God makes the most sense and all that, but the idea of a creative intelligence running the universe is pretty universal in humans from the research I've seen. It's a little unusual not to have it. Although, we even have research on people who don't seem to have that instinct. In any case, so you began questioning atheism, which, by the way, I want the entire audience to hear that again. You can question atheism. You should question atheism. You should get skeptical of atheism and atheists and their assertions. So, you said you were... you started changing when you were in school. You were studying. You're a biochemist, right?
Right.
Were you like an undergrad? Were you doing pre-doc, post-doc work? Or was it kind of...
Well, it was actually not so much my studies in biochemistry, but at the same time that I was in graduate school, I was also reading about, the modern physics, quantum mechanics, and cosmology to some extent. And especially when I began learning a little bit about quantum theory, some of the material that doesn't really go with rational logic, I began realizing, well, wait a minute, if the observer effect is real, and if the uncertainty principle is real, then it doesn't say that there's a God, but it certainly says that the universe is not a simple, rational, logical thing that can be well understood by human beings. So, that put a crack in the whole thing. It didn't lead me to become a theist, but it led me to question some of the philosophical background that supports atheism. And some of that background was, that we can understand everything about the world simply by the application of reason, using the scientific method, that humans can make sense of everything. We don't need God, all of that. that whole structure, that philosophical structure, began to sort of crack, and eventually it crumbled.
I think it really crumbled for me personally. It began crumbling years ago, but I think it finally shattered for me personally, and it sounds like it was close to that for you. Once your mind kind of pops out of the materialist perspective, it's almost impossible to sustain atheism. I can't say it's completely impossible, but
I agree. Yeah.
Once you abandon materialism, and in case anybody doesn't know, materialism classically would be phrased as the universe is nothing but space and atoms in motion, and the results are the same. Today, when we're talking about QM, we might say, I don't know, it's nothing but random quantum wave functions.
Right.
And it all just kind of works out that way. And one of the great problems in quantum mechanics, I here figured it out like a lot of other people, including Einstein, it turns out. I've had some people point out, late in his life, Einstein gave in and caved on quantum mechanics, and
right.
It is a totally normal and completely, what's the word I'm looking? It's an acceptable and mainstream view in physics at this point
right.
to say that stuff's not there if no one's looking at it or observing it. In any case,
there's no scientific argument against quantum mechanics. It doesn't exist. It's been proven so many times in so many experimental ways that there's no argument against its existence. But the philosophical interpretation of what it means, to me, is very profound.
Well, from my perspective, and maybe you can put in another one, you're more scientists than I am, but I haven't gotten anybody to disagree with me on this. The ultimate ramifications of quantum mechanics, as we've seen in test after test, is it seems the only thing that would make sense for reality is that either everything and everybody capable of doing observations together is somehow mass collectively creating the universe, which seems incoherent, but you can make a case for it. You could assume that all of it, 100% of it, is in your head. That would be like all of existence. You're imagining every single thing. Could be. It doesn't seem too likely, but could be. And the rest, the biggest one is either that or there's an independent, intelligent observer of some sort making things happen when we look or don't look. And that points right to what all people would call God.
Right.
Or something like God, you know.
And the exact, it's a totally different field of science, but you can come to the same conclusion when you look at the fine-tuning of the physical constants and cosmology.
That's right. The cosmological constants, which is a totally different area of physics.
Different area, right.
Would run the same thing, though, that if there's certain constants that never change, and no one knows why they don't change, or even if they do, or how or when, but these constants appear to be constant, and if they shifted even a tiny little bit, the universe would be like complete chaos.
Well,
right. I'd like to say snow on an old TV, but I don't know if young people know what that looks like. Well, the universe would be pixelated random noise. That might.
That's right.
In every direction, and it doesn't go that way. And one of the other dirty secrets nobody seems to know is that physicists these days, if they're not, I'm just going to say it because I'm not neutral, if they're not goober ideologues like Lawrence Krauss, physicists run heavily toward the spiritual these days, especially the younger ones. Some of them are even doing parapsychology research on the side and showing results. It's really rather impressive.
I think that's true. I think that physicists in general are very, because of everything they're learning about the universe, and it doesn't stop with quantum mechanics and cosmology, but in so many ways, the universe really does seem to, have something else behind it. And nobody wants to say the name, but the name is clearly God. I mean, if once you're a theist, what I found, frankly, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit now, when I actually realized that I was a theist, I felt like I was coming out of a closet. It was like, I probably believed in God for a long time, but I couldn't admit it to myself or anyone else. And when I finally realized that I was following Christ and that Christ was my Savior, and I was able to say it out loud to myself and to others, I felt not just joy, but a huge sense of relief, because then everything made sense. everything in science made sense. And, it's not that I thought there was no more mystery. Of course, there's still mystery. There's as much mystery as ever. But at least for the first time, I had the feeling that there was a coherent picture.
Okay, so you just didn't make the leap to God. And it's not that much of a leap actually, but it's always a little bit of a leap one way or the other, at least. Right. And for most people, historically, I've found God comes first, and then Jesus or whatever other religion you're jumping into tends to come next. How fast was that transition for you, out of curiosity?
Well, actually, I will say that I think actually Christ came first. And the reason is I had opened my mind to the possibility of God, but I didn't really understand anything about God. I couldn't really understand what I was worshiping or what God was or how God worked or anything. And then it dawned I had a lot of experiences, including a direct experience of the Holy Spirit. And what happened was I realized, well, God told us who he was. He came to earth. He walked among us. He talked to us. He taught us. And that was Jesus Christ. And then everything made sense. And then I feel like, of course, it was just like, yeah, that's God. I mean, so in a way, I didn't have a long phase or any phase where I sort of believed in a God, but I didn't know much about it. And then I started believing in Christ. It was really, I think, Christ that made me a theist.
Well, some people, it goes that way. Every path is different. Mine was strange and tortuous myself. But, all right, so let's back this one up. So you're raised really atheist, like hardcore atheist, like this religious stuff is evil and that Bible is just wicked fairy tales that make the world a worse place. That's the things you were taught to believe. Okay, so where did you learn about Christianity and Jesus and all that made you even able to go, I think? Do you know what I mean, right? Like, were you reading the Bible because you were curious? Did you hang out with this girl? What was the tip?
Yeah, a little bit of the girl, but not much, because I was very young at the time. Uh-huh. But at some point in college, I read the Gospels as part of a literary course. And, of course, I was very opposed to the idea of reading the Gospels. I knew nothing about it. And I was sure that I would be completely turned off and, throw the book across the room. And I was very surprised to find two things. First, they weren't that bad. In fact, there were some things I really liked about the message of this preacher. And second of all, what I found was that, and this may be surprising to some people, but I found that reading the four Gospels, I began to believe that this was not fake, because they agreed on certain things and they disagreed on others. And that's exactly what you expect from a true story. If you get four witnesses to any event and they say exactly the same thing about what happened at that event, it's fake. I mean, it's a lie. You expect to have differences, different stresses, different emphases, different ways of seeing. And when I read, John and compared it to Matthew, which are obviously quite different.
They are.
There's enough similarity in there, and I already knew I knew already that John was written later, and et cetera, different audience. But the similarities were amazing to me, and certainly within the Synoptic Gospels, and so that was a surprise, because I had heard that, Jesus Christ never existed, it was all made up, and the Gospels were written hundreds of years later, and they had nothing to do with, reality. And I stopped believing that after I actually read them. Now, that did not make me a Christian, obviously. It didn't go that far, but it broke down more of that wall that was preventing me from even hearing the call of Christ.
I'll just insert here that if you're somebody who's curious and wanting to read a gospel, I usually recommend people start with John, because it's just so beautiful and so universal. The Gospel according to John, very, very, very good. And you just said something there too. You were opposed to reading it. I'm surprised how many non-Christians are like very opposed to even reading it. I'm like, really? Why wouldn't you at least read it? What are you afraid of?
I
Read the Gospels. Read one of them. See if anything is what you expected.
that's wonderful advice.
I really think terrible advice is start with Genesis and plow on through.
Oh
No,
no,
please don't. Please, God, don't do that. Even any good Jew would say, "What are you doing? No, no."
Yeah, I mean, I like Genesis now, but I've read some interpretations of it that make it palatable. Let's put it that way. And there are parts of the Old Testament that really, I don't know. I don't.
Well, they're rough slugging. If nothing
Yeah,
else,
that's a good way to put it.
You want a good interpretive lens and a guide through a lot of that stuff.
I mean, I frankly, I would almost suggest that if people really are looking for something that might be easier, if they have a very strong, negative impulse about the Gospels and they don't want to start with that, read the Book of Acts, because that's a nice historical treatment of what actually happened. And it's almost impossible to deny that the Book of Acts is true. It just has such a ring of truth.
Well, I'll give you my other tip, which is that I tell people that if they want to read it, they can either start, if they want something very spiritual, start with the Book of John.
Right.
Otherwise, if they're wanting action and facts and details and everything, read the Gospel according to Luke and then plow straight into Acts.
Straight into Acts, right, exactly, yes.
And those are interesting as well. And if you want to read them like a Christian does, you can decide it's all mythology if you want, but if you want to read them like a Christian does, assuming you're reading some history there, and that's how billions of people see it. Mm-hmm. So did you become then, I'm guessing you became what we'd call an evangelical Christian? You're just you're a Bible guy and...
That's a good question. I mean, I'm still a scientist. I actually still do science, actually. Mm-hmm. And I am, as a biologist, of course, I hold to the principles of evolution. I don't deny that evolution is real. I believe that Genesis should be interpreted differently than the young earth creationists interpret it. I completely deny the idea that young earth creationists have a literal interpretation of Genesis. They certainly don't. They interpret it one way, and I think that their interpretation is one. It's not the one that I prefer. I prefer a different one. So, there are evangelicals who define themselves as evangelical because they believe in what they call a strict literal interpretation of the Bible. I don't call it that. But they believe in a particular interpretation of the Bible, which, by the way, I'm sure you know, is fairly recent. It doesn't go back very far.
No, it really doesn't. It's mostly a 19th century American thing, although there have been things like it for more than 2,000 years.
Oh, sure.
In fact, I'll tell you something about the Jews I bet you don't know. Do you know what the Sadducees' main claim to fame was? They only went by the literal text of the Torah. So if it wasn't in there, they didn't believe in it. If it wasn't spelled out for them in the way that was the way they... So that mentality's been around forever.
Yes, absolutely.
They didn't believe in the afterlife because the Torah doesn't explicitly say there's one. It was that sort of thing. But in any case...
But if you look at the textbook definition of evangelical, then yes, I believe I am, because I do want to spread the word of Christ. I try to as often as I can in many ways. For example, I was recently at the National Evangelical Association. Well, actually, it's the National Association of Evangelicals, speaking to students who were attending a meeting there. So, and great people at that organization. So in that sense, I do consider myself an evangelical, in terms of, trying to spread the gospel, the good news, and especially my niche in there is to spread the gospel that science is not the enemy of faith. In fact, science is a good way to worship God.
Well, that's a very old Christian mentality, at least in the Christian West.
Yes.
I mean, it was the organized church that built the university system in the first place and came
Right.
up with ideas like the peer-reviewed system and the university system, and was very responsible for science. I guess I'll soapbox, but Cy probably isn't going to disagree with me too much. One of the reasons Christianity tends to be very compatible with science, and you can say this about some of the other Abrahamic faiths too, is that the belief is that God's that thing running the laws of probability and the laws of physics.
Right.
So you literally can't, like, design an experiment to test for God, because God's the one that's making the experiments possible to work in the first place.
Right.
But it also makes it almost impossible. Well, you can with a little work, but it's really hard to find many cases where science is going to get in the way of, I'm looking at how the thing runs the laws of physics and probability accomplishes things. That almost can't be sacrilegious. It's
Exactly
one of the things that made science come up in the Christian West. It even amazes me that when they come up with stories of conflicts with religion and science, they got a 2,000-year history to pick from, and they have half a dozen maybe specific incidents they bring up.
And those, and even some of those, like the Galileo story, I think you pointed this out in one of your other interviews, or perhaps on your blog. The Galileo story is really almost universally mispresented. For example, in the Cosmos saga story.
I think the biggest thing to know there is that Galileo was demanding that the church take sides when they didn't want to. And other scientists were saying he was wrong, including Johann Kepler.
Exactly.
And the whole thing was embarrassing. It was political. But it's funny that we have to go back that far, where they'll say this or that about stem cell research. It's like, in 2,000 years, the same handful of examples keep coming up. It should set off alarm bells that you're picking on Christians for no good reason.
Right.
I mean, and I mentioned this too. Who listening to this will say no secular source or even dogmatically atheist source ever got in the way of science? Whoops, yeah, they have.
Lysenko springs to mind.
Yeah, although maybe I'll talk to you afterwards. Lysenko's gotten a little bit of a revival, because there's some...
Yeah, yes, you're right. It has a little, but not
like 20, 50 years ago and all that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a complex issue.
It is. It is. But yeah, Lysenkoism, very primitive Lysenkoism, was obviously garbage, propped up for political reasons.
Right.
I don't have to tell you that companies funding science have a strong financial incentive to get the certain results they want. The tobacco company scientists everybody talk about, I don't think they were getting orders from the Pope or from a preacher for that stuff. I don't think, maybe. I
can speak to that one directly.
Oh, can you? You involved in that?
Oh, my scientific field was environmental health, and I worked a lot on tobacco. And I was offered a very lucrative consultantship for a tobacco company.
Oh.
I turned it down, of course, but...
Oh, that is interesting. So...
Yeah, it's quite a story. And you're right, this was not done out of any spiritual motives.
Anybody can get in the way of science. In fact, anybody will get in the way of science if they think there's money or prestige or whatever. I forget which scientist said science advances one funeral at a time, but there's a lot of that, waiting for the old guard to just die. I actually think the next quarter century is going to be really interesting, because a lot of paradigms are falling as we speak in science.
Yeah, well, there's one of the things that I'm very interested in is the current revolution in evolutionary theory, which is finally breaking away from the very rigid neo-Darwinian views of, interestingly enough, mostly atheists. And it's something I don't understand, because the people who are knocking this down are not theists, but the people who are defending the very kind of rigid evolutionary idea that everything is random and there's, it's all just accidental.
Survival of the fittest, yeah.
Like Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne or people like that, Sam Harris, they're not only dogmatic neo-Darwinians, they're also the most dogmatic atheists.
They
And
are.
I don't think that's a coincidence.
I don't either. I'll give you my own theory, and you and the audience can chew on it. One of the things I've noticed, however, is that, and I'm speaking as an ex-atheist, okay? But I've noticed that this was me at one time. This is all the atheists I have known over the year, practically all of them, and I still observe it. They all tend to be what I call strongly reductionist thinkers.
Yes.
And they tend to think, well, there's no proof of that, so it's not true. And we can eliminate that. And even when they want to think of a new idea or fix a problem, the usual first go-to is, what can we eliminate or get rid of?
Can I tell you an interesting story that is real, although probably you won't believe it, but it's really happened.
I've seen a lot, dude. Go ahead.
So I was having a discussion on this issue online at one of the many atheist groups, and I was asked, as usual, please provide your evidence for God or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I countered with, provide your evidence that Kandinsky was a great painter and did beautiful artwork. And the answer was, are you trying to say that art cannot be reduced to quantitative scientific terms? And I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Einstein agreed.
The answer that the atheist gave me was, it's very easy. We can quantitate the value of art by the market price that the painting takes.
That's reduction to economic materialism. That's reduction to economic materialism.
Exactly like yours. I started laughing, and I said, "You cannot be serious, right? You're telling me that we can objectively, reductionistly, whatever, determine the value of art by its market price." That's how far people will go in defense of an absurd idea.
In fact, I was arguing with somebody about this recently, and they tried to say that philosophical materialism and economic materialism are very different. And I said, really? Because most regular materialists / atheists I know, they're almost all economic materialists. They're almost all either huge fans of the likes of Hayek or Ayn Rand, or they're Marxists.
Right.
And I don't think that's coincidence either. Right. I think that what happens, and notice that this popularity of atheism in the sciences also corresponds well with Karl Popper's ideas on falsificationism.
Right.
And that's a scientific idea that you eliminate to get what you want. Basically, you eliminate all the alternatives and you arrive at your correct answer. Now, and that kind of eliminationist approach can be very powerful, but it's far from the only scientific method. And in fact, some science you could never do it. Like I dare you to do that on heart surgery and prove that heart bypass surgery works.
Well, this is the thing that always amused me on atheist sites, is that people talk about these are, of course, never scientists. They talk about the scientific method is you try to prove your idea is wrong, right? That you see that all the time. Yeah. And I've worked in the laboratory for 35 years. I have never seen anyone try to prove their idea was wrong. That's just a joke.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly one way. I think X is true, and now I'm going to try and knock down X. Well, that's one way of going, and it's not necessarily bad, but it's.
No, it's fine. It's just that's not what actually happens. It sounds great, and it does happen to some extent. But most people, when they have an idea, they're excited by the idea, and they're trying to find evidence for it. Now, they don't go overboard because, they have to be careful that their result will stand up. Mm-hmm. But the idea that, every scientist is a strict Popperian is complete nonsense. That's not the case.
No, in fact, I've often noticed that the ones who advocate Popperianism the hardest are the ones who've accomplished the least. But maybe that's just a catty remark on my part. Maybe I'm wrong. But I have noticed skepticism is certainly cheap.
Yeah.
And anybody can be skeptical of anything, which is the other weird thing going on with atheists. I think that being skeptical makes you smart somehow, and scientific somehow. But I think to wrap up and I want you to think about this, maybe everybody listening too, because every serious religious person I've talked to has wound up agreeing with me. Atheists are naturally very reductionist thinkers, and I think it's rooted in first denying God as a possibility, and then looking at the universe through those lenses and finding what else you can eliminate to make the world seem better to you. And so the atheist mind seems to always cut toward that. Who's bothering them? What ideas are bad? And what can they do to get rid of them? I see it over and over again. I saw it in myself when I was an atheist. I saw it in atheist friends. I still do see it in atheist friends. It seems like their go-to frequently is, what idea can we crush or person can we get rid of that's causing all of our woes? Which is, sometimes that'll work, but it's not necessarily smart. So that's what I've seen. They all tend to be wicked reductionist thinkers, and thus predictable as a result. It's very strange to watch.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, there are several philosophical ideas that have become associated with atheism that I never held when I was an atheist 60 years ago or 50 years ago, whatever. In other words, growing up, I never believed that there was no such thing as free will. And what you will hear now from Dennett and all of them is that, free will is an illusion. I never thought that consciousness was an illusion. That's another thing that atheists do not only deny the existence of God,
nope.
They deny the existence of humanity.
They do. It's really funny.
Exactly. And that's crazy because, the old name for atheists was secular humanists, but the modern atheists are no way a humanist in any form.
Well, I would actually say to you, I would quote a pope for you, which would be Benedict. He said, "A humanism without God is inhuman."
Exactly.
And I find that in secular humanism. There's no humanity there.
Well, but in today's atheist world, humanism is ignored. Humans are considered to be basically very smart chimps who have evolved in a way to fool themselves into thinking that they're conscious, that they have, a self, that they have relationships, that they have love. All of these things are illusions.
Oh my God, I talked to some poor girl who was telling me she'd become an atheist, and she was explaining that love really is just oxytocin.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like,
exactly.
Oh my God, you believe that? And that's not science. I'm talking to a biochemist, and he's laughing because he knows, right? I mean,
Well, see, and that's what really gets me crazy is that people will say that, and then they'll say, science has shown it, or science says that, that there's a gene that makes you feel religious. And this is such a distortion of science. It makes me insane. It just gets me very frustrated to hear that.
It's what I'd call a scientismic explanation. It
sounds
sciencey. In fact, just to pontificate, I find that there is such a thing as atheist science. It's always reductionist materialist science. Mm-hmm. In psychology, it's interesting. They've even got their own phrases, which I think really should be marked as atheist or materialist pseudoscience. One of my favorites is emergent effect. Have you noticed that they like to say things like consciousness and other phenomena that they can't explain are an emergent effect, in capital letters often, of the biochemistry or whatever. So your mind is an emergent effect and your consciousness is an emergent effect of the biochemistry in your brain and central nervous system. There's no scientific there behind the word emergent effect. If you braced it down to what it means is, emergent effect means and it goes that way.
Right.
And exactly. It just kind of goes that way. It just kind of does that. So it emerges as an effect.
I actually feel that the whole concept of emergence, which is extremely important, is probably real, but to me, it's a pointer to God, because why should there be such thing as emergence? It's by definition, emergence is a new property that comes out of old properties with no specific causation that you can point to. Now, so that kind of is anti-reductionist. It's the whole concept that emergence exists is actually a pointer to something beyond reductionist materialism.
I agree, and it's patently obvious once you get it. There is something in cognitive neuroscience, for anybody who's listening, something called the hard problem. In fact, it's
Right.
such a well-known problem. You can just Google the hard problem, and it'll come right up. And what you find out from the hard problem is that, yes, as of 2017, they're not even close. Not even close to
Nobody has enough.
explaining consciousness, memory, how the visual and other sensory, it's called the cognitive binding problem. How does it all loop together? They can't find anywhere in the brain to explain that. And it's perfectly reasonable in science now to think, well, that's because part of the mind is simply not in your brain. It's outside space and time in some sense.
Right.
And that's not a wacky view in science anymore.
No.
It's really not.
I mean, it's no more wacky than what we were talking about earlier, the quantum mechanics and the observer effect. All these things were very wacky when they were first proposed, and then they turned out to be, now they're mainstream science. So, mainstream science has been moving very rapidly for the last 100 years towards theology.
And it seems to be increasing. I see that now. Actually, I saw something that made me laugh in two ways. Elon Musk has, came out early last year or middle of last year. He and Bank of America and other billionaires are investing in something called the digital universe theory.
Right.
And this is part of the quantum mechanics that Si and I were just talking about, which is the data that very strongly says we can't be the ultimate reality. There has to be a higher order reality than what we already have, and that we look like we're living in something like the Matrix.
Right.
One of the funniest things I saw, I've seen a few people talk about that, and they were all dancing around the God question, like they were afraid to talk about it, number one. But number two, I heard just weirdly asserted out of nowhere, and doesn't this just disprove religion? And I'm like, well, how so?
There is a video online of Neil deGrasse Tyson running a workshop or a small symposium of about 6 expert physicists. Everybody there is an atheist, including Neil Tyson himself, of course.
He says he's an
agnostic.
And
the subject was, is the universe a simulation? And they all agreed that it is. And they never got to so I actually wrote a blog post, that said, praise the great simulator. I mean, if there's a simulation, somebody is simulating, and who is that someone?
Something is running the simulation.
Yeah, and I mean, are they saying that, there's some alien teenager in his mother's basement?
It goes, yeah. And that's not real good. If it's an infinite, it would have to be infinitely intelligent or something imaginably more intelligent than us.
And then, of course, who created him and blah, blah, blah. So,
and that leaves you ultimately to the question of the unmoved mover, the uncreated creator. This all people call God, said Thomas Aquinas, and even the Jews and quite a few other non-Abrahamic faiths would call that God. The leap to Jesus goes later if you're going to do that leap, or go to any other religion. But and I'll tell you, my turning point as an atheist was, and this was about 10 years ago, what I noticed was bad atheist behavior, very similar to what we're talking about now. And I started thinking, there's just something wrong with these thinking patterns. Maybe there's something wrong with me and anybody who thinks that way. And it was actually the evidence from evolutionary biology that did it for me in the first place. Because what I concluded from the anthropological record, we have records of spiritual stuff happening with human beings before there were any Jews and before there was any Bible books. We got spiritual stuff on humans going back 10,000 years, talking about an uncreated creator and an ultimate powerful force running the universe. And we got reason to think, like the cave paintings, which are 100,000 years and more old, because they were not near where anybody lived. Nobody lived in those caves, pretty clearly. They weren't convenient to anything. But the paintings look very spiritual. Not with Jesus or whatever, but I just looked at it one day and said, you know what, this is natural human behavior. And there's scientific evidence to show believing in the spiritual is natural human behavior.
Yes, there is.
Leading to the question, we either evolved with capacity for a delusion that breaks our common sense, our intelligent, conscious logical faculties and our instinctive, unconscious logical faculties. And we develop that capacity to make us insane as a group survival trait, or they're spirit forces, and we evolved a need to contact them. And that was kind of my little click moment. And it still took years before I was confident, personally. But actually, it was definitely evolutionary biology and looking at, like you, I know there are good Christians who are into the literal interpretation of Genesis and the 6,000-year-old earth, but I actually find that sometimes they're almost as big of bullies as the atheists are, because they want to they suck all the air out of the conversation and turn to this conversation, and I got into a run-in with a couple this weekend, and I felt bad, but at the same time, I'm like, I told you we're not interested in this. Had you told me I had to believe in a 6,000-year-old earth, I probably would have just said, well, your religion is screwy. I
agree with that, but I will say this. Clearly I don't believe in that interpretation, and I don't believe in the 6,000-year-old earth, and clearly the evidence is overwhelming for a very old earth. But I argue with them, just as I argue sometimes with atheists, but I do have the feeling, and I will say this for any who may be listening, that disagreements between brothers in Christ, brothers and sisters in Christ, is one thing. And I think that if we're really Christians, they'll know us by our love, right? That's the words of the song. And we can hammer that out. It'll take time, and it'll take patience and understanding and mutual love as Christ followers. When it comes to dealing with atheists, I admire them as human beings. Some of them are very good scientists or very logical thinkers. But there's a much sharper divide, at least at this point, that I feel, philosophically and in every other way, between militant atheists of today and where I am, than I feel with Christians who, go for young.
What I try to say to my young Earth creationist friends is I could concede the possibility that you're right. Now, will you concede the possibility that you're not? And if we could just start from that basis and mutual respect.
That's a great way.
Because especially really, we're talking about quantum physics and just how loopy weird that is. And by the way, yes, it really is that loopy weird. Literally, almost anything seems possible at that point. You might even be able to prove the Earth's only 100 years old. And we all just kind of popped into existence in the last 100 years and don't know it. It's not impossible when you look at things. And my point is, there is reason to look at even some of the current science and go, well, dinosaurs fighting in the Colosseum, the Roman Colosseum, don't think it happened, but
right.
There's crazier ideas. Because
I think the important point there is to convince people who are biblicists, who really believe that the Bible is the only truth, is that science is not trying to deny that. The reason my blog is called the Book of Works is that I believe in this two-book philosophy of theology, which I guess goes all the way back, which is that, God's book of words, which is the Bible, and God's book of works, which is nature, cannot contradict each other. They're both God's truth. Mm-hmm. And if they appear to contradict each other, that's our fault. We are not interpreting one or the other or both correctly. And the work that I think Christians need to do, and it's going to take a long time and a lot of work, is to find that reconciliation between these two books. Because I absolutely know that ultimately that will happen, because God has one truth. Neither of them are easy to understand. One thing about the Bible, by the way, this goes to a question you asked me earlier, it's probably the hardest book to understand that's ever been written. It's not only one book, of course, it's several books, and
With different
all
genres, different
exactly,
categories,
different styles, and all of that is part of the magnificence of the Bible. If it were a simple little textbook like an auto repair manual or a simple textbook, who would care? It would be boring and dull. You cannot say the Bible is boring. That's one thing you cannot say. And the work that is required to understand certainly the Old Testament, and to a large extent, the New Testament as well. Remember that Christ almost never said anything straight out, right? Every time he spoke, it was a parable. It was a story. It was some kind of
allusion or reference.
Exactly. Yeah. And yes, that's how God speaks to us. And he speaks to us in nature the same way. I mean, science is not easy. We're not going to get all the answers. We're going to keep working, and I believe strongly, as I said before, that the more we learn about science and the more we learn about theology, the closer they come to each other.
Seems to be happening in more areas than people realize. We've done a lot of videos on that on Escaping Atheism, and we'll probably do more. It actually seems rather astounding once you get deep into multiple areas of science. You keep running into God.
That's right.
It's really interesting how that happens. I don't think it's a coincidence. But okay, so we're down. I try to keep these under an hour, and we're really at 57 minutes. So I'm going to kind of wrap up.
Okay.
A couple more questions. I see you got a John Templeton Foundation grant. What's that all about?
It's actually fairly technical. It's about looking at gene regulatory networks, the theory of those, and how that applies to theology is kind of distant. But it also includes work I'm doing on teleology. I just had a paper published in Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith on the existence of teleology and evolution.
Teleology is an old study for anybody who remembers. I think you want to learn your basic teleology, you can start with Aristotle probably, but it's all about what causes what and what, right. And that sort of thing. And a lot of scientists are rediscovering it because they've run into walls on Popperian falsification and some of the old ways of looking at things. What kind of scientific work are you doing these days?
So it's theoretical. I don't have a lab anymore. I'm retired from academia and I worked in academia for 35 years, and I spent a little time at NIH, where I retired.
National Institutions of Health, yeah.
Yeah, National Institutes of Health. I was an administrator there. Mm-hmm. And now I'm basically working on my own with this grant, mostly on theoretical work, do some writing, and I have a couple of papers pending, technical papers. So hopefully those will get published. And I'm keeping very busy in the science-faith area.
Excellent. All right. Well, everybody, we've been talking to Sy Garte today. That's Sy, S-Y, Garte, G-A-R-T-E. His blog is at thebookofworks.com, right? Thebookofworks, one word, .com. It's a very good blog. I may even sweet-talk him into letting me read one of his essays on our YouTube channel. We'll see. And please check him out. Please remember that this whole science versus religion thing is a phony baloney war. I think Sy would agree with me there.
Can I just say one thing, which
you
is
bet, man.
My favorite quote, which I spread on Twitter and on my blog, and that is, science is distilled doxology.
Ooh. Science is distilled doxology. And we will leave it as an exercise for the listener to go look up the word doxology, but it's spelled with an X, just so you know. Doxology. So thanks very much, everybody. Thank you, Sy, for talking to us, or Dr. Garte, as we might say. Check out his blog. Please support us on Patreon, escapingatheism.com. Subscribe, like, all that good stuff. And God bless everybody. You too, Sy.
Thank you.